Welcome to RADEF Officer Training for Seabrook Station EPZ Communities, presented by the HSCM REP Training Program. During this training, we will cover the following topics, such as positional responsibility, identifying emergency workers and their needs, what emergency worker briefings are, and equipment checks, and so forth. This is a pre-quiz to get us started. First question, how often do emergency workers check and record their dosimetry? The answer would be 30 minutes by default and 15 minutes once directed. Next question is, where is dosimetry to be worn? The answer is altogether at center mass on the outermost layer. Next question is, what is the difference between self-reading dosimetry and permanent reading dosimetry? The answer is one is read by yourself and the other one is read by labs, which we'll go into further detail in this training. Next question is, where do emergency workers go when their shift has ended? The answer is now the Emergency Workers Emergency Operations Center, or the EOC. This is a new protocol in which all the communities will have each of their emergency workers go to their local Emergency Operations Center instead of the reception center. We'll next cover the situational awareness developed by FEMA. Exercise and drill to support Seabrook Station emergency preparedness is evaluated by FEMA, and they offer a situational awareness following each exercise to offer information to the communities on how they can improve their radiological emergency preparedness. An ongoing issue that we identify with these FEMA evaluated exercises is dosimetry, and that's because of the scientific nature of the emergency workers, such as reporting, such as using the equipment. Use of dosimetry is a trend across all nuclear power plants across the United States. It's not just localized to just Seabrook Station. Okay. The issues identified with dosimetry are such as the briefings are incomplete or insufficient, the emergency workers aren't familiar with the equipment, they don't know how to zero them, don't know how to operate them, and also that the calibration dates for the equipment are out of date. This is a chart showing the acceptable dose limits for emergency workers for their shift. The first level is the 1 Rankine of dose, and that's the anticipated maximum for an emergency worker to actually be exposed to. The second level would be 2 Rankine, and that's the expected level to be exposed to if they're protecting valuable property. 5 Rankine would be the expected dose maximum for them to be performing life-saving activities or protecting large populations. And beyond 5 Rankine has to be voluntary by the emergency worker, and you have to be aware of those risks involved. The table on the left shows examples of real-life radiation exposure. The 0.2 Rankine is what you would be exposed to if you had a head CAT scan. The exposure of 0.8 Rankine is what you would receive if you got a torso CAT scan. And the 1 Rankine exposure dose is what a radiation worker is expected to receive in a yearly dose, such as those working within Seabrook Station. This chart shows what happens when you're exposed to different levels of radiation, such as at the top where it shows 0 to 5 Rankine as no obvious injury or illness, and as you progress to higher levels, there becomes more injury and illness associated with that radiation exposure. From 0 to 1 Rankine, it's a standard limit of an emergency worker. At this level, there's no obvious injury or illness. From 1 to 5 Rankine, there's still obvious injury or illness. However, at this level, it requires authorization by the EMD and the New Hampshire Division of Public Health Services. Beyond 5 Rankine of dose, it requires the EMD and DPHS authorization, as well as the emergency worker to volunteer to those risks. Listed on this slide are the different procedures and equipment that are associated with the emergency worker. On the right is a diagram of all the different equipment, such as their emergency worker ID, their info badge, the 2 different self-reading dosimeters, the thermoluminescent dosimeter, a 4-day supply of potassium iodide, such as 8 tablets, and the form 135A and the form 305A. The basic instructions for emergency workers to wear the dosimetry is to wear them on the outermost layer of clothing, between their waist and shoulders, and all together. The self-reading dosimeters are read every 30 or 15 minutes. Standard read interval is 30 minutes, while they are read every 15 minutes if there's a release in progress. And as always, only read the self-reading dosimeters into an artificial light source, such as a flashlight or a headlight. These are the 4 emergency classification levels of a nuclear power plant. First level is an unusual event. Second level is an alert. Third level is a site area emergency. And the 4th level is general emergency. Unusual events can be anything minor, such as elevator outages or bleach spills. These minor occurrences essentially just inhibit the power plant from responding as they normally would. Escalate towards general emergency, those are the more notable nuclear power plant meltdowns such as Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. The map of the 10-mile emergency planning zone around Seabrook Station. Each of the towns are divided into different ERPAs, emergency response planning areas. ERPAs are grouped into multiple towns, that way protective actions can be designated for specific ERPAs instead of town-by-town basis. As you can see, ERPAs A, C, D, G, and F are located in New Hampshire, while ERPAs B and E are in Massachusetts. Protective actions are designated per ERPA. Therefore, ERPA D, Hampton and Northampton, would result in the same protective actions being designated for each of those towns. As mentioned before, the emergency workers will be checking their dosimetry and reporting to their RADEF officer for when they reach certain interval levels. The first level they need to report to their RADEF officer would be the 175 milliroentgen. Each of the self-reading dosimeters are different ranges. One is from 0 to 200 milliroentgen and the other is 0 to 20 roentgen. Therefore, the emergency worker will be checking their 0 to 200 milliroentgen dosimeter first. When an emergency worker reaches the first reporting interval level, the RADEF officer will work with the EMD to determine if that position is critical and necessary. If the position isn't necessary, then they would work to remove the worker from that post and potentially have another emergency worker replace that person in that position. If the emergency worker can't be replaced and they need to keep fulfilling that position, you would then instruct the emergency worker to start reading their 0 to 20 roentgen self-reading dosimeter. The next reporting level would be 1 roentgen. As mentioned before, the reporting levels are 175 milliroentgen, 1 roentgen, 2 roentgen, 3 roentgen, 4 roentgen, and 5 roentgen. At each of those levels, the RADEF officer will work with the EMD to determine if positions are critical and if they're needed for replacement. The chart explains the actions that the emergency worker would do at the end of their shift. If there's a confirmed release by the plant or any field monitoring teams, then the personnel monitoring for that local emergency operations center would be activated. If the personnel monitoring determines that the emergency worker is not contaminated, then they can enter the LEOC without being monitored for contamination. The RADEF officer must conduct radiological briefings for their emergency workers. Some important things to remember are that at least 2 emergency workers are needed for every radiological briefing. The briefings can be continuous, meaning that they can go on and be restarted once they end, such as using the DVD or the video to keep it on playback and repeat during the event. Some important things to remember for the radiological briefing are to explain the difference between the 30 and 15-minute reporting intervals, each of the reporting levels, where the emergency workers need to place their equipment, the risks involved with being a pregnant emergency worker, the allergic reaction warning for ingesting KI, the community's reception center, and all the personal documentation needed for the emergency worker. Some additional responsibilities for the RADEF officer is to operationally check 10% of each of the equipment quarterly and all the equipment prior to issuing during an event. Additionally, they're required to set up the rat alert meter, which checks the EOC exposure rates every 15 to 30 minutes. As mentioned, they must conduct the radiological briefing, whether it be verbally through the script or by playing the video on a TV or projector. They also must track and document the exposure records, such as the Form 300A and the 300Y, which we'll describe more further in this training. These are the 3 different types of equipment that are issued during a REP event. Each have their own specific use and advantages. The leftmost are for emergency worker protection. These are the self-reading dosimeters and the thermoluminescent dosimeters. These track the emergency workers in and out of the EPZ and tracks the amount of radiation received. As mentioned before, these are worn all together on the outermost layer of clothing between the shoulders and the waist. The next type of equipment is for EOC protection. This is the Rat Alert 100X. This ensures the EOC is safe and that the workers inside the EOC aren't being exposed to unsafe levels of radiation. The rightmost is the Civil Defense CDV 700. This is used to detect contamination of emergency workers. The device has a wand which you can run up and down an emergency worker to detect where contamination is on an emergency worker. These are the pieces of equipment that are issued to emergency workers for their protection during their shift. The two pen-like instruments are the self-reading dosimeters, one being 0 to 200 milliroentgen and the other is the 0 to 20 roentgen. The scales are noted on the side of the dosimeter. Also here is the thermoluminescent dosimeter, which reads emergency worker TLD on the front. Additionally is the emergency worker badge. The back has all very important information which the emergency worker will need to know, such as phone numbers, the reporting intervals, and the reporting levels. This is a dosimeter charger, which is used to calibrate and zero your dosimeters. First, you unscrew the cap by twisting counterclockwise to expose the electronics, and you would then place the D battery, ensuring the correct polarity. The left is negative, the right is positive. Then place it back on the back plate and twist clockwise to tighten down. To zero the dosimeter, you'll unscrew the charging contact counterclockwise until it's exposed. You would then place a non-clip end onto the charging contact, firmly but slowly until you can't push down anymore. You would then look into the clip end to see where the hairline rests and move it using the right turn dial up or down to bring it as close to zero as possible. When you're done, you release the dosimeter from the charging contact slowly but firmly to ensure it doesn't move too quickly. You can then check the dosimeter by looking into an artificial light source to ensure that it rests at the zero mark or as close to possible as you can. If you release the dosimeter too quickly off the charging contact, it may move off from the zero mark that you just calibrated it to. When you're done calibrating your dosimeters, place the charging contact cap back on and remove the battery from the dosimeter charger. As mentioned before, the instrument used for EOC protection is the RADEF 100X. The RADEF 100X will be inside a Pelican case like this in your EOC. Inside, you'll see a guide on how to operate the RADEF 100X with everything you need to know, such as instructions and diagrams. Inside the Pelican case, you will find the RADEF 100X, a check source, and a 9-volt battery. To install the battery, you'll insert the battery into the battery compartment on the back. On the bottom selector, you'll turn it onto the on position and change it to the dose rate. The RADEF will do a brief system check displaying all the indicators and numbers. Once done, you'll start seeing counts per minute listed in the display. You'll take your source check and place the open side onto the reading window at the top of the device as close to it as possible. You'll leave the source check onto the device until you see a counts per minute reading stabilize. You'll check this level against the level listed on the side of the device to ensure that your device is still calibrated correctly. You'll want to leave the RADEF 100X on its own in the center of the room off the floor and read the readings to determine what the background radiation is. Here we're seeing about an 18 counts per minute background radiation as the constant background radiation level. You'll want to be notified when your EOC is reaching a radiation level that is double the background radiation. Therefore, we'll want to see when the background radiation reaches 36 counts per minute or higher. You can set your rad alert meter to notify you when you've reached that level by using the top buttons of the device. You'll first press the set button, then the plus or minus buttons to set it to the correct level that you want it to alert you at. You would then press the set level again, and it will set that as the background alert level that you would need for your emergency operations center. If your rad alert reaches that level of reading, it'll do an audible alarm to notify you that you've reached double the background radiation of your EOC. As mentioned, the rad alert meter is used for the EOC protection, and when the levels of radiation are reported to the State Emergency Operations Center, that helps the Division of Public Health Services track the plume if there's a release from the plant. To shut down the device, you'll change it from the on position to the off position and remove the battery. Next device is a CDV 700P survey meter, which is used to detect contamination of emergency workers. It has a singular purpose, which is to detect radioactive particles. First, you'll unlatch the side latches, pull up the front faceplate, and install the 4D batteries. You'll then release the wand from the holder and release any of the excess wire slack if needed. You can then remove the red faceplate protector from the wand. Then you'll install the headphones by releasing the cap from the front faceplate and screwing on the headphone jack there. To conduct an operational check, you'll check the side reading to see what the source material should read. You'll then place the wand against the source check of the device and change it to the 100X setting. You want to ensure that the dial reads what the source reading should display, which is on the side of the device. You'll want to use the headphones when using this device, as you can hear the clicks from the readings faster than you can see the dial actually moving. When I move the wand towards the source check, you'll hear the clicks before you actually see the dial moving. When using this device, you'll want to use the counts per minute reading on the bottom scale opposed to the millirankin per hour reading on the top scale. You want to keep the wand 3 inches away from the person and move at about 6 inches per second. If you reach a reading of 300 counts per minute higher than the background radiation, that's when you have detected contamination of an emergency worker. The top scale is in millirankins per hour, which is used to detect radiation exposure, while the bottom scale of counts per minute is used to detect contamination of an emergency worker. Therefore, you'll want to use the counts per minute reading on the bottom scale and not the top scale. On this example, it's using the times 10 scale with a counts per minute reading of about 200, which means the reading would be about 2100 counts per minute. This is a list of all forms and documentation associated with RADEF officers and emergency workers. The first is the community's RADEF officer job aid, which was last revised in 2016. The next is the RADEF officer briefing card or the video. Next are reference materials for the emergency worker and the RADEF officer, such as the operational checks for dosimetry and the Rattler 100X background EOC job aid. Next is the 120L, which is used to track equipment issued to people and stays within the EOC. Next is the 300A, which is the emergency worker cumulative exposure report. This is a form used to determine how many emergency workers in each EPZ community have reached one of the emergency worker reporting intervals of 175 millirankin, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 rankin. The next form is the 135A, which is the potassium iodide acknowledgement form. This form is used for the emergency worker to agree that they will only ingest Ki when instructed to do so, that they understand why potassium iodide is being instructed to be ingested, that they should not take potassium iodide if they are allergic to iodine, and that if they choose not to ingest Ki, that they should report the decision to the RADEF officer or supervisor as soon as possible. The next form is the 300Y, which is the individual cumulative exposure report. This is used by the RADEF officer to track each emergency worker and at what time they have reached one of the reporting interval levels. Multiple copies of this form can be used for different time frames throughout the operational period. The next form is the 120A, the chronological event log. This form can be used by the RADEF officer or the EMD to track when significant activities and significant events occur within an operational period. Next is the emergency worker information job aid. This job aid outlines everything that an emergency worker needs to know in order to conduct their shift. Highlights include how to wear the self-reading dosimetry and thermoluminescent dosimeters, how to read their self-reading dosimeter, how to record their self-reading dosimeter readings, when to notify their supervisor or point of contact of when they've reached certain interval levels, all information regarding ingestion of potassium iodide, and what they will do at the end of their shift. The final form is the 305A, the dosimetry Ki report form. On the 305A, the emergency worker will include contact information at the top of the form. In the middle of the form, they'll include serial numbers and equipment information for dosimetry and TLDs that they receive. On the bottom right, they'll include information on when they ingested potassium iodide. And on the bottom left shows where each copy of the form goes to. The white or top copy of the form stays with the emergency worker. The yellow or middle form goes to the New Hampshire Division of Public Health Services at the reception center if the emergency worker needs to go to a reception center. And the pink or bottom form goes back to the issuing organization, such as the Community's Emergency Operations Center. These are some important things to remember. There's a local RADEF officer job aid that was provided to each community as a template, which was created in 2016. Additionally, for you to know, is that all the procedures and guides on how to operate each equipment and all the associated information for the emergency workers are all documented in the job aids and forms. Also, the three primary areas to focus on are the equipment, the paperwork, and the radiological briefing. Also, that the equipment is now operationally checked and issued along with the paperwork at the alert level. Previously, these were conducted at the site area emergency classification level. However, this change was decided because certain actions, such as setting up traffic control points, takes a very long time to implement, and that it all needs to be conducted at the alert level, as conducting these activities at the site area emergency level would be too late. Also, please remember your EOC drill boxes. These are in the Emergency Operations Center, and all papers should be taken from there. Next, we'll do a post-training review of the topics we covered today. First question is, how often do emergency workers check and record the dosimetry? The default is 30 minutes, and it would then change to 15-minute intervals once directed. Next question is, where is dosimetry to be worn? Dosimetry is to be worn altogether at center mass on the outermost layer of the emergency worker. What is the difference between self-reading dosimetry and permanent reading dosimetry? Self-reading dosimetry, the emergency worker reads by themselves, and the other is read by the labs. Where do emergency workers go when their shift has ended? The answer would be the community's Emergency Operations Center. At the EOC, the emergency worker will be screened for contamination and directed to the reception center if needed. What is the number of KI pills issued to an emergency worker for the 4-day coverage period? The answer would be 8, which are 2 pills per day. Which piece of dosimetry is the legal record of dose and is read by the DPHS lab? This would be the permanent record of dosimetry, aka the thermoluminescent dosimeter, TLD. The other forms of dosimetry are the self-reading dosimeters, which can be reset by the emergency worker or the RADEF officer. 1 Rankin, 2 Rankin, 3 Rankin, 4 Rankin, and 5 Rankin. Next, what must the RADEF officer do when an emergency worker reports receiving one of the dose limit levels? When this occurs, the RADEF officer will work with the EMD to determine if an emergency worker replacement is necessary and if it can be made. If the position is necessary and a replacement cannot be made, they will then communicate with DPHS on the approval process for the emergency worker to be exposed to higher levels of radiation. Where would an emergency worker report for decontamination? They would report to the community's reception center. How would your community request additional supplies such as dosimeters? You would initiate a request from the state through calling the HSCM field rep, the State Emergency Operations Center, or creating a mission task in WebEOC. You can find rep training materials we covered today on our Resource Center page in the rep dropdown and choose rep training. On this page are links on how to take our online training such as Rep 101 and Rep 9. Below that, you can find links to the videos explaining how to operate the equipment we covered today, such as the self-reading dosimeters, the RAD alert, and the CDV 700P.